Hi, this is Somni Bhartiya, and welcome to another episode of TFR Insights by RackN. And today we have with us once again Rob Hirschfeld. Rob, things have changed in the last few weeks because of COVID-19 or coronavirus. What does it really mean for the industry in general? Like, there is going to be a downturn. What do you think about that? Let's talk about the impact first.
Swapna, we really have to look at what's going on multiple vectors. It's very clear that we are shifting a lot of work to online and remote work and things like that, but we also know that there will be supply chain distribution. So getting servers is likely going to be harder because it might not be the whole server. It might just be one or two components that are impacted. And then a lot of people have racks that are assembled and shipped pre-configured, or having somebody in the data center to do it. So there's no doubt at all that all of the economic pieces will create supply chain disruptions. And, more broadly, with the markets going way down, it looks like people should be preparing for, a recession and a retraction in spending as a whole. So there's a lot of changes in budgetary processes that we're waiting to see shake out. But from a planning perspective, we should be looking at, worst case scenarios and thinking through what that would mean.
If you look at colo, even when you talk about AWS Outpost, where somebody will come and do all the movement, people moving around is also restricted. So I'm just concerned that if something goes down, you may not even get guys to come over and repair and fix it for you. Did you ever think about that?
We think about that quite a bit. And this is what we've seen with Edge. In Edge infrastructure, you already have to plan for IT to be done by remote because you can't get to the cell tower or the gas station or the fast food restaurant. You might not have, or the battlefield. You might not have the people in place to do that. And so we really have to build systems that are much more resilient and self-automated. What I see the impact of the COVID-19 is having people say, wait, I might not be able to travel to the data center to do maintenance. And so from that perspective, we really have to be even more efficient at automated systems, self-repairing systems, more out-of-the-box capability, and then very importantly on day two. Because a lot of companies that we know, actually, if they have to do a widespread BIOS or flash upgrade, a lot of times that involves sending people to the data center. And that's simply not acceptable. Or doing a very fragile process that you have to supervise very closely. Once again, not really acceptable. So we have to rethink, how all IT is done with this lens of, I can't get there, I can't touch the gear, I can't send people out. And it's a really important factor to consider.
Now, let's go back to the first point that you're making. You may not even be able to procure new hardware. So is there any way you can either, downshift and repurpose the old resources that you have? What would you do if you get stuck in that situation?
So the general term we use for this is brownfield infrastructure. So brownfield infrastructure is the gear you already have. And during the last 10 years, we've gotten really lazy about basically just saying, throw out the old stuff, bring in the new, and very siloed. So a new thing comes in, you just start using the new thing, you leave the old doing what it used to do. We didn't spend any time really trying to reuse that asset. But in a downturn, those assets are paid for. If you can put them into productive use, patch them or upgrade them, then that becomes, actually a great source of revenue. So the idea that we have sort of always been moving towards greenfield deployments, I think needs to shift pretty dramatically. Ideally, it would shift either way because there's a lot of valuable infrastructure that we've already built. We just need to be able to reuse it. One of the ideas that I think is very compelling on the whole disaster recovery is that we typically have thought of disaster recovery as moving to a new site. COVID-19 is really making me think through what would it take to repurpose gear from one use to another. So for example, VDI, a virtual desktop infrastructure, you might have 10% of your workforce a month ago. Now you need 90% of your workforce to be able to use it. It would be really nice if we designed our data centers so that, my HPC cluster could actually be pivoted over to a VDI cluster. And that type of dynamic change in infrastructure takes time and some expertise to build, but it also creates real opportunities for being able to have a disaster reconfiguration where all the gear's there, but we've repurposed it or changed how we use that asset. That type of thinking actually is a great business model anyway. We've just sort of gotten out of the habit of trying to operationalize capabilities like that.
Talking about brownfield, a lot of gear that you're talking about is your existing, old gear, and you're talking about repurposing it either with VMs or what about Kubernetes?
A lot of gear in the data center is dedicated to virtualization. And you're right, we see Kubernetes on bare metal as a way to take an older machine without as much RAM or disk space or CPU horsepower and repurpose that as a containerized infrastructure. Frankly, that could actually deliver a tremendous amount of capacity if we were able to take gear like that. And that frees up resources. It allows us to be very flexible about how we use infrastructure. Kubernetes is well designed for that. Bare metal Kubernetes is not trivial. There are things that you have to account for in the systems, but there's a lot of interest in market for bare metal Kubernetes. A month ago, I wasn't recommending it because it was cheap and easy to buy new systems and put virtualization on it. But if you're looking for taking your existing fleet of gear and getting a doubling of performance, relative performance on it, switching it over to a Kubernetes infrastructure could be fast and cheap. Really shouldn't be overlooked when you're considering how do you get more without spending a lot of money.
What kind of impact it would have, if you're tightly integrated with one vendor?
Yeah, supply chain's a really interesting question from this perspective. So sometimes having a single vendor does help you optimize and integrate. You have fewer APIs to work with from that perspective. We've seen in the multi-cloud conversations, just like we've seen in traditional data centers, having multiple vendors does shield you from supply chain shocks, which we're about to see. It also shields you from prices, and allowing you to have some flexibility from that perspective. But let me get very specific, because even if you single vendored, you might find that the type of drive that you had assumed, or one of the chips or components that you assumed, is now in short supply. And if you need to purchase gear, or that gear is no longer available because you've changed vendors or even from the same vendor, having the flexibility to reconfigure your gear based on changing components is very, very critical from that perspective. So, our experience has been very clear. Having a single vendor does not shield you from infrastructure changes that could break the automation that you have. It's a question of making the automation resilient.
Does that also mean that you have to go for more do-it-yourself kind of solution because the vendor may actually not be available or not be willing to meet the demand that is there in the market?
We get the question do it yourself quite a bit, especially around open source. And in a downturn, people are like, oh, I want to save every penny. Sometimes there is a question of time and resilience and having infrastructure to support you. So, while do-it-yourself does save money, it can also build very fragile, bespoke, hard-to-maintain systems, and it can slow you down. So just because you're in a downturn doesn't mean you have a lot of time. As a matter of fact, I would expect the opposite. If we see a lot of layoffs across the industry, then you're going to have fewer resources, fewer people to do the same amount of work. And in those cases, building a big stack of do-it-yourself technology just to save costs on software or hardware is actually not necessarily the right idea. So there's a balance in all these things, right? Being able to leverage expensive infrastructure by using brownfield gear makes a ton of sense. Being able to take ownership of that gear so you can control the costs makes a ton of sense. But be strategic about what you pick and choose. For RackN, we help people with RAID and BIOS configuration. It's absolutely not specific to any business. It's cross-industry. It's very complex stuff to help do. And so by helping companies have a consistent, repeatable pattern where they don't have to reinvent the wheel, which happens all across the industry, then that helps accelerate your business. It takes something, off of your plate. And you should always be thinking in a downturn, how does the work I do today position me for the recovery? Because there will be a recovery.
I will also go back to the point that you're making about there will be a lot of layoffs and but at the same time, when there are a lot of layoffs, that also means you have a lot of resources available at a much affordable cost now. So suddenly you will have a surge of a lot of resources that were not available earlier. What kind of impact that will have on the industry?
Yeah, the shame of it is that just because people have been laid off doesn't mean that you have the cash to hire them. If we can see a light at the end of the tunnel, then people would start hiring sooner. But by and large, even though there's a lot of available talent on the market, it takes really funding a project to commit to a long-term hire. And so this is one of the biggest challenges that you have to decide, what long-term commitments you want to make as you rebuild or as you build infrastructure, reconfigure your infrastructure in a downturn. That's the challenge. It's one of the reasons why using gear you already have is really attractive, because it's already been bought and paid for. And so it's not a long-term commitment to configure it into another use case. And that becomes a really interesting story from that perspective. It's also a great time to clean up technical debt and not just build things really fast because you're trying to get things done, but actually build something that'll scale.
Before we wrap this up, I just want to get your opinion from the higher level overview that because of this crisis, a lot of things have happened. People realized that how many meetings they were not supposed to go to. They also realized that remote working is actually not just kind of a fad for certain companies where they use it. Also, you cut down a lot of resources. You do things that are really necessary. So a lot of resources we are wasting. We are rethinking the whole process, the way we are operating as an industry. Do you think there will be some long-term effects, which will actually make some, long-term, long-lasting effect on the way that this industry operates, especially, if we talk about software industry, which is mostly remote either way? What do you think about that? It's a higher level overview.
Oh, I think that it's hard to predict all of the ramifications that we're going to see. I do expect we're going to reevaluate whether or not we have to travel for meetings to the extent that we have, whether we have to travel to conferences to the extent that we have been. I do expect people to be a lot more questioning when they start looking at, voluntary travel, and that's going to be a big deal. At the same time, I think that we might want to hold more inventory for things and look at what shortages. We're going to have a very visceral experience with shortages of things and what that looks like. So some lean supply chains might be questioned, or how much capacity do you buy? And so we haven't seen really how broadly these things are going to shake out. I think psychologically, a lot more people are going to ask questions before they get on an airplane. They're going to have learned that they can work by remote and have meetings by remote and be more effective at that. So I think that would be a good thing. RackN's a remote workforce. Our team is distributed, and we've already been relying on all these terms. So for us, that disruption is very small. However, we know that our customers aren't always practiced in being able to do remote work, and that learning that skill, because it is a skill, I think will be a benefit to the industry as a whole.